From the studios of EWTN Radio and Television, this is EWTN Theology Roundtable, a conversation with the experts of EWTN's Theology Department. Join us with your questions about theology, liturgy, and what the teachings of the Catholic Church mean in our everyday lives. Now, EWTN Theology Roundtable.
Well, welcome to our listeners and viewers on the EWTN Theology Roundtable. We're going to be speaking this month. Our topic is going to be a new document from the Congregation for Catholic Education called Male and Female, He Created Them, Towards a Path of Dialogue on the Question of Gender Theory in Education. And we named the program perhaps in a way, to just raise thinking about it, is Gender Theory, Is Dialogue Possible? In part because a lot of questions have been raised, certainly about the document and how it is to understand. How do you dialogue with those who, in many cases, are unalterably opposed to the Church's teaching and to what the Church has to say about gender issues in general, whether it's homosexuality or whether it's all the other permutations that have been come up with in the last decade or so. So we want to talk about that a little bit today, and so we have here with us today, we have Noah Lett and Laura Dittus to assist and to help explain the document and then talk about the issue in general, because it's certainly true that in the public domain, this is something that is more and more going to be encountered. It's not just an issue of what do we do in Catholic education? That's somewhat straightforward. You teach the faith. But what about those who are in public education or in other systems of education which do not respect what the Church believes on human sexuality and gender theory? So we want to draw some lines there and help people to understand the state of the issue. Now, the document begins, which I think is generally a very good section that deals a number of paragraphs, I think up to about paragraph 12 or section 12, dealing just exactly what the issues are. So, first of all, it notes that there is the ideology of gender. This ideology is saying that it responds to the aspirations of people with different affections and for, I guess you'd have to say almost for different sexual kinds of behaviors. But the Pope, quoting the Pope at least, the document notes that in addition to an effort to respond to perhaps understandable aspirations, the ideologist also seeks to assert itself as absolute and unquestionable. And this, of course, is something of very much public interest because they want to dictate in schools and in the public square how children are raised and how people behave and speak, and even perhaps for Americans limit the First Amendment in the way that you could speak about other persons. So it's become a very complex issue, and the Pope, or rather the congregation, quoting the Pope in Amoris Laetitia, immediately brings that up. Then the document talks about the human sciences and how in the 20th century, and as an effort to understand gender, is lived out in different cultures. So even for those of us who recognize male and female, we know that different cultures have a way of expressing it. If we look at our culture, sometimes if you go by the movies, you get the sort of the macho man or, the manly man. You get a John Wayne type. Or on the other hand, you get maybe a very feminine, coy, coquettish kind of female image. And those are what the culture is throwing at us and then mixing it up with a lot of other things today. So culture has a possibility of giving different ideas of how gender should be lived. And we certainly see that. And the human sciences, sociology, psychology, and so on, have sought in the 20th century to understand all of that. And that itself is a good thing, but what has not been so good is that they have reduced the matter to the question of the individual. What does the individual person feel? What is their personality attracted to? And this reduces human nature and the design of human nature, whether you believe in God or whether even if you believe in evolution, did evolution design, for example, the atheist must ask himself, that there be all these different genders? What evolutionary purpose would that serve? So these are legitimate questions, but again, as we go back to that first comment in the document, it sometimes seems as if there's only one answer to these questions, the answer of the gender theory and the gender ideology. So we have this sort of a reductionist approach based on the idea of science, that by describing how human beings behave, that somehow tells you what's normal behavior. And so if you could say that a certain segment of although the majority of the population, say, is heterosexual, there's some homosexuals, there's these other genders and so on, the very fact that these other affections exist constitutes normal for them. And so we've reduced the idea of nature and its purposes down to simply an individual reading of feelings and so on. So that's a very good section, I think, that lays out the issue. And it ends up really by pointing out the fact that how can you have an effort of sexual morality, and you might say of any area, if the only ethic upon which you can base is the personal feelings and so on. Even if you say, well, nobody is harmed, say, by misguided sexual behavior, except perhaps the individuals themselves. But what about other kinds of human behavior? Do we say they're normal simply because they exist? And I think the ethical basis of this new cultural view of human beings is very, very flawed in reducing everything to the individual and their feelings. So what is the appropriate response, which is the next area which the document takes up? And it is a solid philosophical and theological understanding of man, what you could call philosophical anthropology. What does reason tell us about the nature of man? And theological anthropology, what does revelation, and of course in the church, the magisterium, tell us about human nature and the sexes and so on and so forth. But in the end, we recognize, Laura, as we've mentioned at the beginning, that if you have people so adamantly and aggressively, some portion of them, certainly not everybody, want to insist on a rigid acceptance and structure of the gender questions in a society without no room for freedom of speech or freedom of thought, how do we dialogue with them? Mm-hmm. And the document goes into that in a good deal of detail.
Right. So if you look at the structure of the document, it takes up three main verbs, and those are listening, reasoning, and proposing. And one of the big themes that comes out a lot in the document is dialogue. And so dialogue is built around these three main verbs: listening, reasoning, and proposing. In Section 5 of the document, it cites the Second Vatican Council Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, Gaudium et Spes 7. The document states, "In fact, listening carefully to the needs of the other, combined with an understanding of the true diversity of conditions, can lead to a shared set of rational elements in an argument, and can prepare one for a Christian education rooted in faith that," quote, "throws a new light on everything, manifests God's design for man's total vocation, and thus directs the mind to solutions which are truly human," unquote. Entering into dialogue about gender, therefore, recognizes the other with whom one is conversing, their needs, and the reality of the modern conditions. You're really listening to the other person. You're hearing them. You're seeing reality as it is. The light of natural reason shows us that man has a particular nature and that his embodiedness is central. And this, again, is from the document, Section 24. As an integrating element of personal identity and family relationships, unquote. It bears witness to the, this is from paragraph 28, quote, "physiological complementarity of male-female sexual difference that assures the necessary conditions for procreation," unquote. So we have the light of reason and then the light of faith. The light of faith speaks of, this is from paragraph 5, quote, God's design for man's total vocation, unquote. This vocation is to be found within man's nature and entails a call to self-gift and communion, both with God and with one another. This call keeps in mind the nature of the human race as male and female, with each being given a particular mission.
So this is what the document is saying in terms of the anthropology. We want to unpack that a little bit. You know, we might say that if human sexuality wasn't necessary for procreation, we could all have been made asexual and been completely insertable function-wise into everything that human society needs, but we're not. So that sexual differences has that one purpose, procreation, which of course the church firmly asserts. And we'll be back to talk about that after the break.
Welcome back to EWTN Theology Roundtable on EWTN Radio and Television. Join our conversation with your question or comment. Call us toll-free, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Outside the U.S. and Canada, call 1-205-271-2985 or send us an email, etr@ewtn.com.
Well, this is Colin Donovan back here with our roundtable this month on gender theory. Is dialogue possible? And the new document from the Congregation of Education situating the questions of gender theory in education and how they should be handled and dealt with and so on and so forth. Before we continue on, we were talking about gift and communion and the male-female role just before the break. I want to give you our call-in numbers. We just got them from Tom Price, but just to repeat those, if you're in North America, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-EWTN or 288-3986. And if you're outside North America, country code 1 plus 205-271-2985. That's 1-205-271-2985. So you can call in and ask your questions to the panel. We're going to let Noah explain as well what he looked at more intensely, perhaps, than either of us did here in a moment. And then we'll come back and take your questions. So you can call those in or you can text us at our EWTN text number is 55000. So you text us at 55000. You wait for our response and give your first name and the question. And if you're watching us on EWTN.com streaming, I would, if you have a question, I'd go over to either our EWTN YouTube channel or our EWTN Radio Facebook channel, because there the comment boxes are ways in which you can ask questions as well. So we've got the radio Facebook, we've got the EWTN YouTube channel, and of course we have the telephone and the smart device, and all of those ways you can get in touch with us. So we were talking about the unique role of human sexuality in human nature, because, I mean, you would say by divine decree, we would certainly understand it the way, but even evolutionary-wise, to say that what is the purpose of that distinction? Is it simply pleasure, or is it to bring about the next generation? We might have been created all unisexual, but not. We were created in this binary fashion, male and female, and that allows us to, other than to have children, to do what?
So the document talks a lot about Christian anthropology, and so this has to do with the study of man and what Christianity has to say about that. So human beings are made for communion and self-gift in a particular way according to their embodied nature. Men are to be other-directed in a particular way, and women are called to be other-directed in a particular but different way. More extreme versions of gender theory give primacy to feelings and to choosing your gender, like Colin was saying earlier. The Christian is called to accept his nature as male or female and to so fulfill his particular vocation to love. And then this again is from the document, paragraph 32, and it cites Pope John Paul II within there. The Holy Scripture reveals that the wisdom of the Creator's design, which, quote, has assigned as a task to man his body, his masculinity and femininity, and in that masculinity and femininity, he, in a way, assigned to him as a task his humanity, the dignity of the person, and also the clear sign of the interpersonal communion in which man fulfills himself through the authentic gift of himself, unquote. Faith, basing itself on divine revelation, teaches that human beings are, quote, again from the document, a unity of body and soul, unquote. And this next section comes from the sections 32 to 33. A unified totality which integrates the vertical dimension, human communion with God, with the horizontal dimension, constituted by the interpersonal communion that men and women are called to live, unquote. This vocation to love, therefore, includes both a horizontal and a vertical dimension and does not neglect the particular masculine and feminine vocation to self-gift. So the differences in the sexes are meant for a particular way of living, a particular call to human love.
In another context, the church speaks about the complementary.
Mm-hmm.
There's a bodily complementary not found within either sex with the same sex. So there's that bodily complementary. There's a psychological complementarity. And so all of these serve the procreative task of human sexuality. Now, they also has many other benefits, as the church has always noted, going back to Augustine and others, that they have different benefits on purely daily material level of mutual support and love and all of these elements. But for the Christian, this communion tells us something about the communion within God, a communion of love that serves love, and this is what we are called to do. So this is a radical view based on what the culture is saying today. We would have said 25 years ago that was the radical view, but now what the churches teach, it seems to be the radical view in terms of being out of popularity at the margins of the culture and so on and so forth. And this is particularly acute in education. In countries like, take Canada, for example, where Catholic schools can have their own systems, but yet the government is encroaching more and more on that. Nonetheless, the religious education is done through those tax-supported schools. In the United States, that's not the case. You either homeschool or you go to a private school or you send your kids to public school where you're at the behest or you're basically have to resign yourself to what the bureaucratic system has decided is the curriculum, the ethic, and the morality on issues like this. So where is this crisis going, and what is the church's answer to it?
But I want to call the listeners' attention to several things about the document that are quite important. We can't overlook the fact that it was issued by the Congregation for Education and not just the Doctrine for the Faith, because they see this as an issue not just of getting a particular apologetic right for a particular topic in the culture. They see this as having become, the word in our time, Colin, was systemic, that it's become a part of curriculum in many, many places. And so they tell us that we have to fight a curriculum with a better curriculum and not just fight a topic with a better apologetic. And so at the very beginning, they tell us it is becoming increasingly clear that we are now facing what might be accurately called an educational crisis. And they mention the fields of affectivity and sexuality. And then more particularly in paragraph 1, they mention gender ideology, in which they say it conveys a neutral conception of the person and of life, yet in fact it reflects an anthropology opposed to faith, right reason, and I'll add my own words, the human person. Okay? It's also important for us to realize that they tell us that it's not just having the correct apologetic, but we have to have the correct method. And they state in the document in paragraph 5 that they want to help the individual address the issue in a methodical way, which is one of the ways they mention the path to dialogue. As Laura noted, the document itself, if you look at, it doesn't come with the table of contents, but if you look through it and you see the titles they give themselves, it has an introduction and a conclusion, and then the three verbs she mentioned. It mentions listening, reasoning, and then proposing. And the reason it brings these out is because they think that this is not just a good way, but the most effective way to speak to the student, to fellow teachers, to administration, to people that have to pass the curriculum that you want them to pass. And they say this in paragraph 52. It says, in conclusion, the path of dialogue, which involves listening, reasoning, and proposing, appears the most effective way toward a positive transformation of concerns and misunderstandings. Now, we all can understand how we very much enjoy when we're talking to individuals that they let us finish. And if they don't know something, that they let us tell what they don't know, so we can have a full understanding of what each other has. So you want to listen. This is not rocket science. Okay, and then hopefully when you talk to one another, you sort and sift the information. It's not always about knock down, drag out who won the fight. It might be having new information, resorting the information or recategorizing it, or finally arriving at the real question you should talk about next week, because you spent 3 hours talking together and realized that the question is really some other question that you wanted to talk about.
And you only uncover that by drawing out of them what it is really bothering them or what their questions are.
Yes. And finally, I want to say that the document makes it very clear that one of the reasons we want to do this is not just because it's effective, but because it reveals something very wrong in the radical gender ideology people, and that is what? That they don't want to allow conversation. They don't want to learn new facts. They don't want to have to explain their facts to you. They want to bully you with their facts. And in the end, they don't want to talk about maybe better ways of dealing with some issues they've brought up that might be legitimate, might not be legitimate. But unless we can talk together and share our ideas, we certainly will experience an isolation from one another. We won't experience community. We won't experience loving and caring. I mean, we all would like to have our parents, no matter how old we are. Like, I'm 63. I hope my mother listens to me, when I talk to her, and not just dictates to me because I'm still her son, So these are important points about the document that I think shouldn't be overlooked in all our discussion about what it says about gender ideology, not to forget that curriculum component.
Yeah. And, as we were preparing for this show, we did some nitpicking on elements in the document where it's quite unclear, with regard to the issue of dialogue, just exactly what is being said there. But if you think of the long pedagogical tradition, and even the evangelical tradition that the Church, especially since the Vatican Council, has gone upon, and that is that first of all, education is not proselytizing. We call that propaganda in that context. Yeah. But it is this idea of informing, convincing, and now that becomes a proposal for a new way of life if the person accepts that. And so that's very close to what the Scripture says, and Aquinas and others say, about if you find fault in your neighbor, how do you fraternally correct them? How do you draw them to the truth? And so circumstantially, you have to find ways to understand and what is necessary for them, what will appeal to them, and what language, what approach will appeal to them. So in many ways, this is a very traditional approach, even though I think sometimes the explanation of the approach seems a little bit odd in places. Well, we're going to take our break here in a moment, and before we do that, I want to give you those numbers again. So we'll take your questions after the break, and you can call us at 1-833-288-EWTN, or if you're outside the country, 1-205-271-2985, or you can text us at 55000. Give your first name and your question, or you go to our radio Facebook page or our YouTube channel and ask your questions there. Back in a moment.
Welcome back to EWTN Theology Roundtable on EWTN Radio and Television. Join our conversation with your question or comment. Call us toll-free, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Outside the U.S. and Canada, call 1-205-271-2985 or send us an email, etr@ewtn.com.
Well, we're back with our roundtable on gender theory. Is dialogue possible? I'm Colin Donovan. I'm here with Noah Lett and Laura Dittus. And we've talked about the 3 stages that are mentioned in the document, and that is to listen to the other person, always good if you wish to evangelize or change their heart, or even correct the errors of the mind. We have to remember that errors of action proceed from errors of understanding, errors of the mind. And so if you're going to do that, you have to sort of wade into where they're at and work there. So, and then the reasoning with them would be one way of dealing with that. And then finally, to propose the truth to them, this is something that falls at the end. And all of that is in accordance with right reason, the norms of fraternal correction, and so on and so forth. This is not telling somebody who's about to jump off the precipice, don't jump because suicide is, you'll be apart from God for the rest of eternity. No, this is telling people who maybe are on a long road that leads to the precipice, and you have the time to educate them, you have the time to bring to them the truth. And in the educational context especially, you have that kind of time because you're dealing with them particularly. We have a YouTube question here from AJ, which I think is on target for this. She asks, how as a Catholic mom do you bring awareness to your children about this ideology? And at what age is it appropriate? Now, in some way, kids are already aware of it because it's in the culture. But a parent should be thinking about this because it's going to come up. And so you need some way of dealing with it when it comes up, and you need some systematic way, methodological way, as it says, to bring this knowledge to the child, because the parents are the first formators, the first educators. They have that responsibility.
I think in today's day and age, unfortunately, kids are exposed to this a lot earlier than they were 20 years ago. And so it's really a prudential judgment on the part of the parents as to when to bring it up in their home. I mean, even within the United States, there's a huge difference of how soon someone might be introduced to it in, say, a city like San Francisco versus a city like Birmingham, Alabama, in their own classroom or within their friend group. And so a parent really has to kind of pray about that and see, when do I need to tell my child about this? And I think a lot of times it's initiated by the child too. The child will bring certain questions or certain situations to a parent, and then they can be addressed at that stage.
And it's going to be different if you're homeschooled or if you're in the public school. In the public school, it'll come up a lot earlier. Or if you take your child to the library to get, some benign little book to read, and the drag queen reading hour is on, when you might have some explaining to do in that context as well. So it's quite different based on the child and the circumstances.
I think that the parent should recognize the following. They're engaged in the process of teaching their child's common sense, exercise their common sense with skill. We should not yield our common sense to an expert unnecessarily. We should emphasize to our kids what they see as what it is, and because that's what they're going to think. And we should say to them when they encounter the drag queen, or this is somebody who thinks. Now, that's the truth. You may not want to say that out loud, but you're going to say that to your kid because you want to reinforce the common sense that comes to their eyes, in their senses. And they see a girl, they see a boy, and they know they're different. And you can explain to them, these people think this, or they're confused this. Another point to be made is, it is true that there are people out there whose bodies are born in a biologically confused way. And these people need to be held.
Ambiguous sexuality, that's true.
But they want to take what is the rarity and turn it into the choice anybody can make, just on the basis of this rarity. And we need to make sure that these people understand that the rarity is the rarity, and there's evidence for it being what it is in the rare case. But when you just want to say, I can decide what I want to be today, a boy or a girl, because I want to go in the girl's bathroom, I mean, that's what it amounts to. Yeah. Where people can just make an arbitrary choice. There's no psychology paper they got to present to say, oh, this is really the case. I've been in therapy and I've been talking to this person and the biologist, and I got all the paperwork that says, yeah, I'm really having to deal with this problem. But we're dealing with people who simply want to gain advantage, to bully others, to satisfy desires that will pass away.
Right. And here you're talking largely about the ideologues, because there are, our Lord spoke often about, there are a lot of confused sheep out there. Mm-hmm. And so the trouble is that is the person before you a person who needs light and grace, or is a person before you an ideologue who has made themselves the enemy of the truth? Mm-hmm. That's an important distinction on how you're going to respond to them. And I think that's not always brought out. And a lot of things get smudged. You mentioned the idea of the ambiguous sexuality. There are genetic and epigenetic and other reasons why a person has a biologically ambiguous sexuality, mm-hmm. where some hormone wasn't there needed when at the point in development in the womb. And you have to remember, sexual differentiation doesn't come when a child is 5 or 6 years old and decides what gender they want to be, but it comes at 6 weeks of in utero life, mm-hmm. when the X and the Y chromosome determine that this pre-gonad, or this primitive gonad, is going to be female or male. Mm-hmm. And once that decision of male is made, or once the particular genes turn on, it's going to go to completion and lead to a male or a female unless something happens along the way. Mm-hmm. And the church recognizes that certain things happen along the way. And so children with ambiguous sexuality are born. Decisions have to be made about, will they be raised as a boy or a girl? And the church permits those decisions in the best interest of the child and in keeping with their true sex insofar as it can be determined. But what we're talking with gender ideology is what you said, Noah, this self-choice. Mm-hmm. These are people who are biologically normal, means physiologically, structurally, morphologically, but yet psychologically or affectively, mm-hmm. that word which the document uses, affectivity and sexuality, they have an affective attraction which is not in keeping with their bodily structure. Mm-hmm. It's a lot easier to change your affections than it is your body. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And the church says you can't change your body except therapeutically to heal.
Yes, to heal.
To heal. Mm-hmm. Psychological things need psychological answers. So it's, it's a very, very sad thing, and you do have to determine at what age your own children. But on the other hand, even in watching cartoons with kids, mm-hmm. you see the ambiguous dressing, and you see the other things. There's clearly an effort being made in television and children's programming to drive it in a certain direction.
If I could just make a footnote
Sure.
too, I think it's really important that parents be vigilant, especially in the public school setting, as to what's coming in the classroom, because there's a lot of things that are not that they may not even be aware of that are being taught at this point. And so really just as a parent to make sure that you're informing yourself as to what a particular school district is providing, and also to make alliances with other parents, Catholic parents in your area, because I think there's strength of that kind of community too.
Yeah, and there are, we tend to forget, and I think our culture is erasing this because institutions of the state and others tend to be jumping into the decisions of parents a lot. Mm-hmm. Yes. But the parents are not acting, in loco, I don't know, rages, in the place of the king, if you will. the schools in these are acting in loco parentis. It is the parental's authority given over to the school to educate the children, and the parents have a right at every moment to say, no, this is a natural right. We talk a lot about natural rights today. This is a natural right of the parents to say to that public school, no, I do not give you permission to teach this class.
And the document emphasizes that point in several paragraphs.
Yeah, and the church does as well, although it's not going to be as big a problem in the church. But, in the 90s, the Pontifical Council for the Family, when John Paul II was Pope, issued a document reaffirming, that even in Catholic schools, where in some very rare instances they were doing very imprudent sexual education, basically saying, the Catholic school can't usurp the rights of the parents either. So this is something that I think people need to know and insist upon. And it has a legal history as well. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know how strong that is. But certainly it's clear in the church. And generally, I think in common law and English law on that, the rights of parents have generally been clear, even though in recent decades they have been impinged upon. Well, let's go to a caller, and we've got Dan in Crooksville, Missouri, listening on Covenant Radio. Good afternoon, Dan.
Good afternoon. Thanks for taking my call, Mr. Donovan. It's very interesting. I had a question and an observation on the use of the pronoun there. In the beginning of your short introduction, it was very good. You said something along the lines, each individual must examine or deal with their problem or their difficulty. And then just now the other gentleman said, first he said children must do something with their, well, that's fine because children is plural. Then the very next sentence he said each child must decide or find out their difficulty. And then in your discussion afterwards,
you've made your point. What are you saying? We need a lesson in grammar, or that we're teaching something contrary in one part of the show that is being said elsewhere? Because I think if you look in grammar books, there is a tradition of the there in those kinds of situations. In the examples that are rising in the public school system, for example, where they're insisting on the pronouns, if they were just as common as there, but they're not. There's Z, and there are all kinds of pronouns invented to serve this ideology. Yes, there could be quibbles over the grammatical usage of there. In other, if you go to many languages, the third person singular is identical to the third person plural, and so they're interchangeable. And so that has a certain resonance as English and well, and I think you would, I think if you looked into that, you'd find it. Are you satisfied, or are we just confusing it for you?
We're just going to disagree.
We're going to disagree because nothing was intended other than that, and probably 40 years ago I would have said that, and 40 years ago Noah might have as well. I don't know. I guess it depends on how thorough your English teacher was and how strict, and the punishments for not speaking correctly in your class. But anyway, but I think that the issue of pronouns is important. Because there's an insistence in gender ideology of using the chosen pronoun. Now, are we going to have 7 billion pronouns on the planet before we're finished because every individual wants to be called? Every person has a name. If you can always call them by their name. Now, Noah will never be a transsexual or an AQT or whatever, but I could just say Noah. I don't have to use somebody's pronoun. It gets a little bit annoying if every time you want to say he, you have to say the person's name. But we have a way of dealing with that. And I think that's a consideration of people who are in those institutions where a certain compliance to this is obligatory. I think you want to think about how you're going to deal with that, because you'll have to at some point. Well, let's go to Woodbine, Illinois, and Elizabeth listening on Sirius 130. Good afternoon, Elizabeth.
Hi, it's me.
Okay.
Thanks for taking my call. I really appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to let you know that when you were saying how the gonads change, either male or female at some point, that's not exactly how it works. In God's perfection, women carry the X chromosome only. So our eggs are always X. Men, however, carry both X and Y, and so each sperm is either X or Y. And when the sperm fertilizes the egg, the sex is determined immediately.
Okay. Well, you're not telling anybody who's been to a basic biology class, I think, anything new. But the point is that many faults go wrong in that. So take, for instance, not to get into too much biological detail, that's not the purpose of the show. A woman can have two X chromosomes, and normally there's what's called X nullification. In other words, only one of the X's will ever be turned on at one point. This has a certain biological purpose for consistency and so on. And so on that X, there can be defects which become expressed as a result of that. And one of the very most unusual defects is a thing called congenital hyperplasia, adrenal hypoplasia, in which the adrenal glands in that woman produces far too abundantly. Most women have a very small degree of male hormone. That has a necessary role. If the adrenal glands in the early are producing too much, it masculinizes them, and they can come out looking very masculine. Or they can come out and they have the metabolic issues that are associated with the congenital adrenal hypoplasia. And so it's not straightforward. And the medicine recognizes, the church recognizes this. Or on the other hand, you can have parts of the Y chromosome lost because, the Y chromosome is a very small chromosome. And so it's mating, but in division of the cell, you have the large X and the little Y. Now, there's a way that the cell does that, but sometimes things happen and parts of the Y are missing, especially the sex-determining region. And when that happens, you end up with a person who is XY or has most of the Y or has them in a variety of cells and in a number of their cells, because as division goes along, other things can happen as well. And so you end up with a person who's technically XY, but is leaning towards the feminine characteristics as well. All of these are recognized phenomena called disorders of sexual development. There's a couple dozen of them. Each of them have a different result. Each of them have a genetic basis. In a failure of the genetics, or the failure of certain genes to function properly, or in the absence of those genes altogether, because it's not only about the X and Y. They find now that what is on the other 22 chromosomes, called the autosomes, also influences the sexual development. So XX and XY determines male or female, but there are many things which determine how the body and the physiology and the brain develop, and they don't understand them all. And the church has said consistently over the decades since these problems have been noted that you make a determination. Medicine makes it, science makes it. You determine in this child's situation how they ought to be raised based on their true sex and what is in their best interest. This is entirely different from gender ideology, as I was pointing out, where all of this works normally, but the person says, I am not what my body and my genetics tell me to be. So it's really two different issues. And the issue, I hear this all the time from people, well, it's as simple as there's an X and an X and there's an X and a Y. It's not that simple because of disorders of sexual development, because of the things we're finding out in genetics that can go wrong. And there's a whole other field called epigenetics now, which talks about how genes are expressed and the manner in which they can be wrongly expressed because of epigenetic changes in the coding that surrounds the chromosomes. So as these things work themselves out, the church will sort through them, but always in favor of determining the true sex of the individual, and not simply imposing a physical solution on what is a psychological problem, as in the case of the gender ideology, the gender dysphoria, and so on and so forth. Now, I will say a lot of the people, this is recognized, I think, that a lot of the people who are promoting this may very well have disorders of sexual development, but a lot of them do not. And the treatment of the differential treatment of those who have a disorder of sexual development and those who have a psychological problem, this is very key. And any moral theologian in the church and the episcopacy and the papacy will tell you this is also. So it's a very complex thing, and I think this goes to your question of listening, Noah. If you run into something saying, oh, it's black and white, you're going to end up not reaching the person. And there will be some people who are legitimately confused, maybe because they have a disorder of sexual development, and there are others who have a psychological problem. And how do you find this out without listening, without being open to them? And I think what the document is saying, what even Pope Francis is saying, is that initial opening has to be welcoming, to use a word which, not in common parlance, I think, for people who believe strongly in the faith, sometimes that means, give away the store to people. But no, welcoming in the sense of, I'm ready to listen to you.
Yeah. It's important the document isn't naive, because it recognizes that there are people who are very radical and aren't ready to listen. And as a matter of fact, in paragraph 6, it makes this point. In the middle of the paragraph, it says, he says, there are sometimes these radical gender ideology people assert themselves as absolute and unquestionable, even dictating to children how they should be raised. And thus they preclude dialogue. Key sentence. However, other work on gender has been carried out which tries instead to achieve a deeper understanding of the ways in which sexual difference between men and women is lived out in a variety of cultures. It is in relationship to this that we can have a conversation.
Right, because the way it ought to be lived out must be based on the masculine and the feminine. But we know that every culture may have different expressions of it than we have.
And the key word, they're open to research, the other group are not.
Right, yeah. And I think that's important. I don't know, did you, Laura, have anything to say on that topic? Okay. Anyway, I hope I wasn't too hard on Elizabeth, but I think it's important. You can find the information on all of this information on the internet. You can find it in Catholic Moral Theology texts with regard to the theological implications of things, or the National Catholic Bioethics Center website. They have frequently asked question pages dealing with a number of these issues. But I think the main thing is to indicate sex determines gender. We never thought of gender as anything other than male and female up until the last decade or two. I just pulled this off of some university's medical school's website. At 6 weeks, the uterus is forming in a girl. At week 7, the testes are forming in the man, the boy. And testosterone and androstenedione, I think that's misspelled, but anyway, 2 of the androgens, or the male hormones, are produced at week 7 in utero, with the result that the undifferentiated organs that would go female if nothing was done now are essentially converted from that undifferentiated state into male organs. You have 2 sets of ducts in there, one destined for the fallopian tubes, one destined for the tubes that connect the testes to the outside, and the associated organs and things like the seminal vesicles. All those things now are converted, or the female stuff is shrunk down and begins to disappear. The male stuff is developed and advanced and complete. The process goes towards completion. So we have the basic male-female dynamic right when we talk about XX and XY. But we can't be sort of dictatorial in saying that every instance of a person who has some dysphoria does not have a biological basis. He may very well. But I'm afraid today medicine is not looking for that answer because they've accepted the paradigm that whatever you say you are, and I'm going to help you get there. So I think we need to rethink this, and we need to be able to be informed and to dialogue with people. Otherwise, we're going to find ourselves unable to reach the culture, and the people in the culture who legitimately want to grow in faith in Christ, but are simply confused and need to be guided as to how to do that. So we hope we've spread some light on the issue this week. If not, I guess tune in some other roundtable. We'll probably be taking it up again. God bless.